Sarah Chen adjusted her tactical vest for the third time in 10 minutes. The pre-mission briefing had ended an hour ago. But something felt wrong. After 12 years in special operations, she had learned to trust that nagging feeling in her gut. Tonight's mission was supposed to be routine, a simple intelligence-gathering operation behind enemy lines in the disputed territory of Moldakistan. The hangar buzzed with activity as the rest of Strike Team Alpha prepared their equipment. Sarah watched her teammates check their gear with practiced efficiency. Marcus, the team's demolitions expert, was carefully packing his explosives. Jennifer, their communications specialist, tested her radio equipment one final time, and David, their sniper, cleaned his rifle with the devotion of a monk tending to a sacred relic. Colonel Harrison approached the team, his weathered face showing the strain of commanding operations in this forgotten corner of the world. The conflict in Moldakistan had been raging for 3 years now, a proxy war between two superpowers played out in the mountains and valleys of a country most people couldn't find on a map. Remember, this is intel only, Harrison said, his voice carrying across the hangar. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. We need to know what's in that facility, not blow it up. The satellite images show it's heavily defended. But intelligence suggests they're developing something that could shift the balance of this entire conflict. Sarah nodded along with her teammates, but her attention was drawn to Lieutenant Rodriguez, who stood slightly apart from the group. Something about his body language bothered her. His eyes kept darting away when she looked at him, and his usually steady hands seemed to have a slight tremor. Rodriguez had joined their unit just 3 months ago. Transferred in from another division, after what the official reports called administrative restructuring. The team moved to the equipment bay to conduct final checks on their parachutes. This was always Sarah's least favorite part of any mission. Despite hundreds of jumps, she never quite got used to the idea of throwing herself out of a perfectly good aircraft, with nothing but a backpack full of silk between her and the ground. She laid out her main chute on the packing table, running through the checklist she had memorized years ago. Lines straight, no tangles, canopy properly folded. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect, maybe. Sarah frowned as she examined the risers more closely. The stitching on the left riser looked different somehow. Newer than the rest of the equipment. Something wrong with your gear? Rodriguez's voice made her jump. She hadn't heard him approach. Just being thorough, Sarah replied, not looking up from her inspection. You know how it is better safe than sorry. Rodriguez laughed, but it sounded forced. Yeah, of course. Can't be too careful, right? Especially with all the equipment failures we've been having lately. Sarah's blood ran cold. There hadn't been any equipment failures lately. In fact, their unit had one of the best maintenance records in the division. She looked up at Rodriguez, studying his face carefully. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I should probably double-check your backup chute too, Rodriguez said, reaching for her reserve parachute. Regulations, you know. That's okay, Sarah said quickly, pulling the backup chute closer to herself. I've got it covered. For just a moment, Rodriguez's mask slipped. Sarah saw something cold and calculating flash across his features before he recovered his friendly demeanor. Sure thing, Chen. Just trying to help out a teammate. After Rodriguez walked away, Sarah continued her inspection with renewed intensity. What she found made her stomach drop. The stitching on her main chute's risers had indeed been tampered with small cuts hidden beneath new thread that would fail under the stress of deployment. Her backup chute showed similar signs of sabotage, even more carefully concealed. Sarah's mind raced. Someone wanted her mission to end before it began. But why? And more importantly, who? Rodriguez was the obvious suspect, but sabotaging equipment required knowledge and access that suggested the conspiracy went higher up the chain of command. She glanced at her watch. 30 minutes until takeoff. Not enough time to requisition new equipment without raising questions. Sarah made a quick decision that would have horrified her instructors at jump school. She would complete the mission without a parachute. Moving quickly and quietly, Sarah began gathering alternative infiltration gear. The enemy forces in the target area were known to patrol in small aircraft, conducting reconnaissance flights over their territory. If she could somehow acquire one of their parachutes, or use their own insertion methods against them, She might still be able to complete the mission. Sarah slipped away from the main group and made her way to the intelligence section of the base. Captain Williams, the intelligence officer, looked up from his computer as she entered. "Chen, shouldn't you be with your team for final prep? I need to see the latest reconnaissance photos of the target area," Sarah said. "Specifically, any images showing enemy patrol patterns and equipment." Williams pulled up the satellite imagery on his screen. "Here's what we've got from the last 48 hours. Enemy patrols have been using these small observation aircraft for reconnaissance. They're doing regular drops of supplies and personnel using basic military parachutes." Sarah studied the images carefully. The enemy aircraft were small, single-engine planes that looked easy enough to intercept if she could get to the right position. More importantly, she could see parachutes and gear scattered around their forward operating bases. "What about their base security?" she asked. "Light to moderate. Most of their forces are deployed forward, defending against conventional attacks. They're not expecting infiltration from above, especially not from someone using their own equipment." Sarah nodded, a plan beginning to form in her mind. It was crazy and dangerous, but it might be the only way to complete the mission and survive Rodriguez's sabotage. She returned to the hangar to find her team making final preparations for departure. The aircraft that would take them to their insertion point was already warming up on the tarmac, its engines creating a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. "Where have you been?" Marcus asked as Sarah rejoined the group. "Just double-checking some intel," she replied, shouldering her pack. The weight felt different now that she knew she wouldn't be using her parachutes, but she couldn't leave them behind without arousing suspicion. Colonel Harrison gave the final mission briefing as they walked toward the aircraft. "Intelligence gathering only," he repeated. "Get in, find out what they're developing, and get out. Radio silence except for emergency situations. If you're compromised, extraction will be at Secondary Point Charlie, 24 hours from insertion." The team climbed aboard the C-130 transport aircraft, settling into the uncomfortable seats that lined the cargo bay. Sarah found herself sitting across from Rodriguez, who kept glancing at her with what she now recognized as anticipation. He was waiting for her to discover the sabotage, probably planning to express shock and offer to take over her part of the mission. As the aircraft lifted off and climbed toward cruising altitude, Sarah closed her eyes and went over her alternative plan one more time. Instead of jumping with her team at the designated insertion point, she would wait until they were closer to the target area. When the aircraft turned for its return flight, she would make her way forward and convince the crew to make an unscheduled deviation. The flight to the insertion point took 2 hours. Sarah spent the time observing her teammates, trying to determine if any of them were part of the conspiracy. Marcus seemed his usual self, focused and professional. Jennifer was reviewing her communications protocols. David sat quietly, probably running through shooting scenarios in his mind. Only Rodriguez seemed nervous, constantly checking his watch and fidgeting with his equipment. Sarah noticed that his gear seemed heavier than usual, as if he had packed extra supplies. That made sense if he was planning to take over her portion of the mission after her equipment failure. 15 minutes to insertion point, the loadmaster announced over the aircraft's intercom system. Sarah's teammates began their final preparations, checking equipment one last time and moving toward the rear of the aircraft where they would make their jump. Sarah followed, maintaining the appearance of readiness while her mind focused on what she would need to do after they left the aircraft. 10 minutes out, the rear cargo door began to open, letting in a rush of cold air and the thunderous noise of the aircraft's engines. Below them, the mountains of Moldakistan stretched out in the moonlight, dark and forbidding. Sarah watched as her teammates lined up for their jump, each of them focused on their individual missions. She felt a pang of guilt for deceiving them, but there was no other choice. If she revealed the sabotage now, the entire mission would be compromised, and whoever was behind the conspiracy would simply try again with better planning. 2 minutes. Marcus was first in line, his bulky frame silhouetted against the open door. Jennifer stood behind him. Then David. Rodriguez positioned himself between David and Sarah, probably hoping to be close enough to witness her equipment failure. 30 seconds. The red light above the door switched to green. and Marcus stepped into the void without hesitation. Jennifer followed immediately. Then, David. Rodriguez paused at the door, looking back at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read in the dim light. "Come on, Chen," he shouted over the engine noise. "Time to go." Instead of moving forward, Sarah stepped back and shook her head. "Equipment problem," she shouted back. "Go ahead. I'll follow on the next pass." Rodriguez's eyes widened with what looked like genuine surprise. But he had no choice but to jump or risk compromising the entire team's insertion. With a final confused look, he stepped out into the night. As soon as Rodriguez was gone, Sarah made her way forward to the cockpit. The pilot, Major Thompson, looked surprised to see her. "Chen, why aren't you with your team?" "Equipment failure," Sarah said, hoping the lie would hold long enough for her to implement her plan. "I need you to take me to a different insertion point." Thompson frowned. "I can't deviate from the flight plan without authorization from command." Sarah had anticipated this response. "Major, I have reason to believe there's been sabotage of mission-critical equipment. The safety of my entire team may depend on getting me to the target area through an alternate route." The accusation of sabotage got Thompson's attention immediately. In a war zone, equipment tampering was taken very seriously, and the consequences of ignoring such a warning could be career-ending. "What kind of sabotage?" Thompson asked. Sarah showed him the damaged stitching on her parachute risers, explaining how the cuts would have caused catastrophic failure during deployment. Thompson examined the evidence with the careful attention of someone who had seen too many good soldiers die from equipment failures. "Jesus," he muttered. "Who would do something like this?" "I'm still trying to figure that out," Sarah said. "But right now, I need to complete my mission. Can you get me close enough to the target area for an alternative insertion?" Thompson studied his charts for a moment. "There's an enemy supply route about 10 kilometers from your target. Our intelligence shows they use small aircraft for resupply runs. If I can get you close to one of their flight paths, you might be able to improvise from there." It wasn't perfect, but it was better than anything Sarah had hoped for. "How long until we reach that area?" 20 minutes, give or take." Sarah spent those 20 minutes going over every detail of her modified plan. She would need to intercept an enemy aircraft, somehow acquire their parachute equipment, and then make her way to the target facility. It sounded impossible when she put it like that. But impossible missions were what special operations teams trained for. As they approached the area Thompson had identified, Sarah could see the lights of small aircraft moving through the valleys below. The enemy was indeed conducting regular supply runs, just as intelligence had indicated. "There," Thompson pointed to a small plane flying a predictable pattern between two mountain peaks. "That one looks like it's heading toward a supply drop. If you can get close to their landing zone, you might be able to acquire what you need." Sarah nodded, understanding that what Thompson was really saying was that she would need to engage enemy personnel and take their equipment by force. It wasn't ideal, but it was her only option. "Can you get me close enough to rappel down?" Thompson checked his instruments. "I can get you within 50 feet of the ground over their flight path. You'll have to fast rope down and hope for the best." Sarah gathered her equipment, focusing on the essentials she would need for the ground phase of her mission. Her rifle, ammunition, communications gear, and explosives for emergency situations. Everything else would have to be improvised using whatever she could acquire from the enemy. As the C-130 descended toward the enemy supply route, Sarah moved to the cargo door and prepared her rappelling gear. The mountain terrain below looked treacherous in the darkness, full of rocky outcroppings and steep slopes that could easily break an ankle or worse. 2 minutes out," Thompson called from the cockpit. Sarah clipped her rappelling device to the rope and took a deep breath. This was the point of no return. Once she left the aircraft, she would be completely on her own in enemy territory, with no backup and no way to call for extraction if things went wrong. The aircraft slowed and dropped to its minimum safe altitude as it followed the enemy supply route through the mountain valley. Sarah could see the lights of the enemy plane ahead of them, apparently unaware of their presence. "Go," Thompson shouted. Sarah stepped out into the void, rappelling down the rope as fast as she dared. The ground rushed up to meet her, and she hit the rocky slope harder than she would have liked, rolling to absorb the impact. Above her, the C-130 was already climbing and turning away, disappearing into the night sky. She was alone in enemy territory, armed only with her rifle and her determination to complete the mission. Somewhere ahead of her, an enemy aircraft was making its supply run, carrying the parachute equipment she would need to infiltrate the target facility. Between her and that aircraft stood unknown numbers of enemy soldiers who would kill her without hesitation if they discovered her presence. Sarah checked her compass and began moving toward the sound of the aircraft engines, staying low and using the rocky terrain for cover. The mission that had started as routine intelligence gathering had become something much more dangerous, a solo infiltration operation using improvised tactics and captured enemy equipment. As she made her way through the darkness, Sarah couldn't help but think about Rodriguez and the carefully planned sabotage of her parachutes. Someone had wanted her mission to fail, but they had underestimated her determination to succeed. Whatever the enemy was, developing in their secret facility, she was going to find out about it. Even if she had to use their own equipment to do it. The enemy aircraft circled overhead like a mechanical vulture, its engine noise echoing off the mountain walls. Sarah pressed herself against a rocky outcropping and watched through her night vision scope as the small plane descended toward what appeared to be a makeshift landing strip carved into the mountainside. This was her chance to acquire the equipment she needed, but it would require perfect timing and more than a little luck. Through her scope, Sarah could see 3 figures moving around the landing area, setting up flares to guide the aircraft in. They wore the distinctive camouflage uniforms of the Moldakistan Liberation Front, the rebel group that controlled this sector of the disputed territory. Intelligence reports indicated they were well-trained and heavily armed, but they weren't expecting an infiltrator to drop out of the sky behind their lines. The aircraft touched down with a slight bounce, its propeller kicking up clouds of dust that provided additional cover for Sarah's approach. She moved quickly but carefully, using the rocky terrain to mask her movements as she closed the distance to the landing strip. The engine noise would help cover any sound she made, but she still had to be cautious. As she got closer, Sarah could hear voices speaking in the local dialect. Her language training allowed her to pick up fragments of the conversation, something about a delayed shipment and problems with the radio equipment. One of the ground crew members seemed particularly agitated, gesturing emphatically at the aircraft. The pilot shut down the engine, and the sudden quiet was almost startling after the constant noise. Sarah froze in place, knowing that any sound would now carry clearly in the thin mountain air. She watched as the pilot climbed down from the cockpit and joined the ground crew in unloading supplies from the aircraft's cargo compartment. What she saw being unloaded made her pulse quicken with anticipation. Military parachutes, exactly what she needed. The enemy was apparently resupplying their forward positions with personnel and equipment drops, which explained the regular flights Thompson had observed. Even better, she could see rappelling gear and other specialized equipment that would be useful for her mission. Sarah counted the enemy personnel, 4 total, including the pilot. They were armed but relaxed, clearly not expecting trouble in what they considered secure territory. Their weapons were slung casually over their shoulders, and their attention was focused on the supply operation rather than perimeter security. Moving with the patience that had been drilled into her during years of training, Sarah worked her way around to the far side of the landing strip. The aircraft was between her and the enemy soldiers, providing concealment for her approach. She would need to time her move carefully. Taking out 4 armed men simultaneously would be nearly impossible, but if she could catch them when they were separated or distracted, she might be able to level the odds. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The pilot announced that he needed to check something in the engine compartment, leaving the other 3 men to continue unloading supplies. 2 of them were working together to move a heavy crate, while the third had walked about 20 meters away to relieve himself behind a boulder. Sarah moved like a shadow, approaching the isolated soldier from behind. Her training in close-quarters combat served her well as she applied a sleeper hold that rendered him unconscious without giving him a chance to cry out. She quickly zip-tied his hands and feet, then dragged him further into the rocks where he wouldn't be immediately discovered. 1 down, 3 to go. The pilot was still bent over the engine, his attention completely absorbed by whatever mechanical issue he was investigating. Sarah crept up behind the aircraft, using its bulk to shield her from the view of the 2 men still unloading supplies. When the pilot finally emerged from the engine compartment, Sarah was waiting for him. "Not a sound," she whispered in his ear, pressing the muzzle of her sidearm against his neck. "Cooperate, and you'll live through this." The pilot's eyes went wide with shock, but he was smart enough to recognize his situation. He nodded slowly, raising his hands to show he wouldn't resist. "Good," Sarah said. "Now we're going to walk very quietly to where your friends are working. You're going to tell them that you found a problem with the engine and need their help. Nothing more, nothing less. Understand?" The pilot nodded again. Sarah could feel the tension in his body, the barely controlled urge to run or fight. But fear kept him compliant. She guided him around the aircraft toward the two men who were still struggling with the heavy supply crate. "Hey," the pilot called out, his voice only slightly strained. "I need some help over here. The engine's making a weird noise." The two soldiers looked up from their work, annoyed at the interruption. As they approached, Sarah stepped out from behind the aircraft with her weapon raised. "Hands up, now." The soldiers reached for their weapons instinctively, but Sarah's voice stopped them cold. "I can put bullets in both of you before you clear leather," she said calmly. "This doesn't have to end badly for anyone. Just do what I tell you, and we'll all walk away from this." The older of the two soldiers, apparently the team leader, slowly raised his hands. "What do you want?" "Your equipment," Sarah replied. "Specifically, your parachutes and climbing gear. Consider it a temporary loan." "You're American," the soldier observed. "Special Forces." Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she gestured for all three men to move away from the supply pile. "Sit down over there. Hands visible. If anyone moves suddenly, everyone dies. Is that clear?" The men complied, settling onto the rocky ground with their hands resting on their knees. Sarah kept her weapon trained on them while she quickly examined the supplies they had unloaded. The parachutes looked to be in good condition, standard military issue but different from what she was used to. The packing was slightly different, and the control toggles were positioned differently than on American equipment. "You," she said, pointing to the pilot, "show me how these parachutes work." The pilot hesitated, then began explaining the operation of their equipment in broken English. The basic principles were the same as American parachutes, but there were enough differences to make her nervous. Using unfamiliar equipment for a combat jump was dangerous under the best circumstances, and these were far from the best circumstances. Sarah found what she was looking for in the pile of equipment: a complete parachute rig with both main and reserve chutes, along with a tactical harness that would allow her to carry her mission equipment during the jump. There was also rappelling gear that might be useful for getting into the target facility. "Where's the fourth man?" the team leader asked, apparently noticing that one of his people was missing. "Taking a nap," Sarah replied. "He'll have a headache when he wakes up, but he'll be fine." She quickly gathered the equipment she needed, testing the harness to make sure it would fit over her gear. The parachute pack was heavier than she was used to, and the straps were positioned differently, but it would have to do. "How far is it to the research facility?" she asked. The soldiers exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them trying to decide whether to cooperate or resist. She made the decision for them by pointing her weapon directly at the team leader. 15 kilometers, he said reluctantly. "Northeast. In the valley beyond the ridge," Sarah nodded. That matched what she remembered from the briefing maps. If she could get airborne again, she could cover that distance quickly and still have time to complete her mission before dawn. "I'm going to need your aircraft," she told the pilot. The man's face went pale. "I cannot let you take my plane. They will kill me if I return without it." Sarah considered this. She didn't want to cause unnecessary problems for the man, but she needed transportation to get close enough to the target for an effective parachute insertion. "Then you'll fly me there," she decided. "Drop me over the target area, then return here and tell your superiors that you had engine trouble and had to make an emergency landing. By the time they figure out what really happened, I'll be long gone." The pilot looked even more unhappy with this suggestion, but he didn't argue. Sarah could see him calculating the risks, and realizing that cooperation was his best chance of survival. She used zip ties from her tactical kit to secure the 2 soldiers on the ground, making sure they were uncomfortable but not in any danger. The 4th man was still unconscious where she had left him, but she checked his pulse to make sure he was okay. "They'll get loose eventually," she told the pilot. "Probably in a couple of hours. That gives us plenty of time to complete our business." The pilot climbed back into the cockpit while Sarah secured herself in the passenger seat, her new parachute equipment arranged for quick deployment. The engine coughed to life, and the small aircraft began taxiing toward the makeshift runway. As they lifted off into the night sky, Sarah went over her plan one more time. She would need to jump from a lower altitude than usual to avoid detection by enemy radar, which meant less time for her parachute to deploy properly. The unfamiliar equipment added another layer of risk to an already dangerous operation. The flight to the target area took 20 minutes, during which Sarah familiarized herself with the enemy parachute gear as much as possible. The pilot remained silent, except for occasional navigation updates, clearly hoping that his cooperation would ensure his survival. "There," he said finally, pointing toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a narrow valley. "That's the facility." Sarah studied the target through her night vision scope. The intelligence photos hadn't done justice to how well defended the place was. She could see guard towers, patrol routes, and what looked like anti-aircraft positions. Getting in would be challenging, but that was exactly the kind of operation she had trained for. "Circle around to the north side," she instructed. "I need to see the approach routes." The pilot complied, banking the aircraft in a wide circle that gave Sarah a complete view of the facility. She noted the locations of the guard posts, the pattern of the patrol routes, and most importantly, the areas of shadow where the facility's lighting didn't reach. The main building was larger than she had expected, a concrete structure that looked more like a fortress than a research facility. There were several smaller buildings arranged around it, connected by covered walkways that would provide concealment for movement between structures. "Take me up to 800 feet, Sarah said. "I'll jump from there." The pilot pulled back on the controls, and the aircraft climbed to jumping altitude. Sarah moved toward the door, checking her equipment one final time. The enemy parachute felt strange on her back, but all the critical components seemed to be in working order. "When I jump, return to your landing strip immediately," she told the pilot. "Tell your friends that you had engine trouble and had to circle back. Don't mention seeing anything unusual." The pilot nodded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold mountain air. "What if they don't believe me?" "Then you'd better be very convincing," Sarah replied. "Because, if they figure out what really happened, it won't just be me they're hunting." She opened the aircraft door and felt the rush of cold air. Below her, the target facility was lit up like a Christmas tree, completely unaware that an enemy operative was about to drop into their midst using their own equipment. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped into the void. The enemy parachute deployed with a sharp jerk that felt different from her familiar equipment, but it held together and began lowering her toward the target. She could see the pilot already turning the aircraft away, heading back toward the landing strip where his unconscious teammates were waiting. As she descended through the darkness, Sarah could see the details of the facility becoming clearer. There were more guards than the intelligence reports had indicated, and their patrol patterns were more sophisticated than expected. This wasn't just a research facility, it was a heavily fortified military installation designed to protect whatever secrets lay inside. She steered the unfamiliar parachute toward a dark area between 2 of the outer buildings, hoping to land undetected. The ground rushed up faster than she expected, and she hit harder than she would have liked. Rolling to absorb the impact and immediately gathering up the parachute to prevent it from being seen. Sarah lay still for a moment, listening for any indication that her arrival had been noticed. The facility hummed with activity generators running, vehicles moving, and the constant chatter of radio communications. But none of the sounds seemed to indicate an alert had been raised. She had made it inside the perimeter using enemy equipment, but the real mission was just beginning. Somewhere inside that fortified complex was the intelligence that her superiors needed, and she was the only one in position to get it. The sabotage of her original equipment had been intended to stop her, but instead it had forced her to adapt in ways that might actually give her an advantage. Sarah checked her weapons and equipment, then began moving toward the main building. She had work to do. and dawn was only a few hours away. Whatever secrets the enemy was developing in this hidden facility, she was going to find them and get the information back to her commanders. The mission that had started with betrayal and sabotage was about to become a test of everything she had learned in 12 years of special operations. Moving through the shadows between the buildings, Sarah began her infiltration of the enemy facility, carrying equipment taken from their own forces and using tactics they would never expect. She had turned their attempt to stop her into an advantage, and now it was time to complete the mission that so many people had tried to prevent. Sarah pressed herself against the cold concrete wall of the facility's outer building, listening to the rhythmic footsteps of a guard patrol passing just meters away. The captured enemy equipment had gotten her inside the perimeter, but now came the most dangerous part of her mission: penetrating the main research complex and discovering what the enemy was developing that had her superiors so concerned. The facility was larger and more sophisticated than the intelligence briefings had indicated. Through her night vision scope, Sarah could see multiple levels of security, sophisticated surveillance equipment, and guard rotations that suggested this was far more than a simple research outpost. Whatever was happening here was important enough to warrant military-grade protection. She waited until the patrol had moved out of sight, then sprinted across the open courtyard to the next building. The main research complex loomed ahead of her, a 3-story concrete structure with few windows and what appeared to be electromagnetic shielding around the exterior walls. Getting inside would require more than just stealth. It would require technical skills and careful planning. Sarah circled the building, looking for weak points in its defenses. The main entrance was heavily guarded, with armed sentries and electronic access controls. The loading dock on the east side had fewer guards but was brightly lit and covered by security cameras. That left the service areas on the north side of the building, where utility lines entered the structure through a series of metal grates. Moving carefully to avoid the security cameras, Sarah made her way to the utility access area. The grates were secured with heavy locks, but her lock-picking skills made quick work of them. Within minutes, she had opened an access panel large enough to crawl through. The utility tunnel was cramped and filled with pipes and electrical conduits, but it led directly into the basement of the main building. Sarah crawled through the narrow space, using her tactical flashlight to navigate around obstacles. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and machinery, suggesting that whatever research was being conducted here involved industrial-scale production. She emerged from the tunnel into a basement storage area filled with equipment crates and chemical containers. The labels were mostly in the local language, but Sarah recognized enough scientific terminology to understand that this facility was involved in weapons research. More specifically, the chemical signatures suggested they were working on biological or chemical weapons. Sarah photographed everything she could see, using her camera's silent mode to avoid detection. The evidence she was gathering would be crucial for intelligence analysis back at headquarters. As she worked, she could hear activity on the floors above, voices, machinery, and the sound of vehicles arriving and departing. A stairwell led up to the main floors of the building, but Sarah knew that ascending would bring her into areas with much heavier security. She needed to find another way to reach the research labs, where the real secrets would be kept. Her answer came in the form of an old dumbwaiter system that appeared to connect the basement storage area with the upper floors. The mechanical lift was designed to carry supplies and equipment between levels, and it looked just large enough to accommodate a person willing to take the risk. Sarah squeezed herself into the cramped dumbwaiter and activated the control mechanism. The ancient machinery groaned and creaked as it lifted her toward the second floor, where intelligence reports suggested the main research labs were located. She prayed that the noise wouldn't attract attention from security personnel. The dumbwaiter stopped at the second floor, and Sarah carefully opened the service door to peer into the corridor beyond. What she saw made her blood run cold. The hallway was lined with laboratory windows, and through them she could see scientists in protective suits working with equipment she recognized from her NBC warfare training. They were producing weaponized biological agents on an industrial scale, creating enough deadly material to threaten entire populations. But that wasn't the worst of it. As Sarah moved closer to one of the lab windows, she could see computer screens displaying targeting information for major cities across Europe and North America. This wasn't just weapons research, it was preparation for a coordinated attack that would make the current conflict in Moldakistan look like a minor skirmish. Sarah began photographing everything she could see, knowing that this intelligence would be crucial for preventing a catastrophic attack. As she worked, she overheard conversations between the scientists that made the situation even more urgent. The biological weapons would be ready for deployment within 72 hours, and the delivery systems were already in place. The sound of footsteps in the corridor forced Sarah to retreat back to the dumbwaiter, but not before she had gathered enough evidence to confirm the magnitude of the threat. As she prepared to descend back to the basement, she heard voices speaking English with American accents. Peering through a crack in the dumbwaiter door, Sarah saw two figures in military uniforms approaching one of the laboratories. Her blood froze as she recognized one of them, Lieutenant Rodriguez, the man who had sabotaged her parachutes and tried to prevent her from reaching this facility. But Rodriguez wasn't alone. With him was Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer who had briefed her team before the mission. Sarah's mind reeled as she realized the scope of the conspiracy. The sabotage hadn't been the work of a single rogue operative, it went all the way to the top of her unit's command structure. She listened carefully as Rodriguez and Harrison spoke with one of the scientists. "The American strike team has been neutralized," Rodriguez was saying. "Chen's equipment failure ensured she never made it to the target area, and the rest of the team completed their decoy mission without learning anything significant." "Excellent," Harrison replied. "How long before the first phase of the operation can begin?" 72 hours, the scientist answered. "We have enough material for the initial strikes, and the delivery systems are already positioned in the target cities." 1. Sarah's training kicked in as she realized she was listening to the final coordination meeting for a massive terrorist attack. Rodriguez and Harrison weren't just traitors, they were active participants in a plot to use biological weapons against civilian populations. She activated her emergency recording device, capturing every word of the conversation. The evidence she was gathering would be enough to stop the attack and expose the conspiracy, but only if she could get it back to loyal personnel at headquarters. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with the three conspirators reviewing targeting information and discussing coordination with other cells in various countries. Sarah learned that the biological weapons weren't the only component of the planned attack. There were also conventional explosives, cyber warfare components, and coordinated political operations designed to destabilize multiple governments simultaneously. When the meeting finally ended, Sarah waited until the corridor was clear before emerging from the dumbwaiter. She had enough intelligence to prevent a catastrophic attack, but she still needed to find a way to escape from the facility and get the information to trustworthy authorities. The problem was that her normal extraction procedures would lead her straight back to Rodriguez and Harrison, who would ensure that her intelligence never reached the right people. She needed to find an alternative way to contact loyal personnel and warn them about the conspiracy. Sarah made her way back to the basement storage area, avoiding security patrols and surveillance cameras. Among the equipment stored there, she found what she was looking for, a radio transmitter powerful enough to reach friendly forces outside the immediate area. Setting up the radio in a shielded corner of the basement, Sarah began transmitting on an emergency frequency that would be monitored by multiple agencies. She used authentication codes that only the highest levels of command would recognize, ensuring that her message would reach people who could take immediate action. Broken arrow, she transmitted, using the code for a nuclear or WMD incident. "This is Operative 77 Alpha, with flash priority intelligence. Biological weapons attack planned for major population centers within 72 hours. Repeat, biological attack imminent." The response came within minutes, a voice Sarah recognized as belonging to General Matthews, the theater commander who outranked everyone in her chain of command. 77 Alpha, this is Thunder 6. Authenticate your transmission with Zebra protocols. Sarah provided the authentication codes that proved her identity and confirmed that her transmission wasn't being made under duress. She then began uploading the photographs and recordings she had gathered, along with detailed intelligence about the facility's location and defenses. Thunder 6? Be advised that the conspiracy includes Colonel Harrison and Lieutenant Rodriguez from my unit. They are actively participating in the attack planning and believe they have successfully prevented me from discovering the plot. General Matthews's voice was grim when he responded. Copy that, 77 Alpha. We're initiating emergency protocols immediately. Can you maintain your position for friendly extraction? Sarah looked around the enemy facility, calculating her chances of remaining hidden until rescue forces could reach her. Negative. Thunder 6. Security is too heavy, and my presence will be discovered soon. I'm initiating independent extraction procedures. Understood. Emergency extraction teams are being dispatched to your area. Vector 270 from your current position. Distance 15 kilometers. Call sign Phoenix. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began destroying the radio equipment to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. She had completed her mission and exposed the conspiracy, but she still needed to escape from the facility and reach the extraction point. Moving through the basement storage area, she gathered supplies that would be useful for her escape: water, emergency rations, and medical supplies. She also found explosives that could be used to create a distraction during her exit from the facility. Sarah set timer-delayed charges in the basement, positioning them to damage the weapons production equipment without causing casualties among the research personnel. Her mission was to gather intelligence and prevent the attack, not to wage war against scientists who might be working under duress. With the charges set for 15 minutes, Sarah made her way back to the utility tunnel through which she had entered the building. As she crawled through the narrow space, she could hear increased activity in the facility above. Apparently, someone had discovered evidence of her infiltration. She emerged from the tunnel just as the first explosion echoed through the building behind her. The blast wasn't large enough to cause structural damage, but it would disable the weapons production equipment and create enough confusion to cover her escape. Sarah sprinted across the compound toward the outer perimeter, using the chaos caused by the explosion to avoid detection. Guards were running toward the main building, leaving gaps in the perimeter security that she could exploit. She reached the fence line and used her rappelling gear originally taken from the enemy soldiers at the landing strip to scale the barrier and drop into the forest beyond. Behind her, the facility was alive with searchlights and shouting voices as security teams tried to determine what had happened. Sarah moved through the forest with practiced stealth, navigating by compass toward the extraction point General Matthews had specified. The terrain was challenging, but her physical conditioning and survival training served her well as she covered ground quickly while avoiding pursuit. Dawn was breaking over the mountains when she finally reached the extraction point, a small clearing where a military helicopter could land safely. She activated her emergency beacon and settled down to wait, knowing that friendly forces were on their way. The sound of rotor blades announced the arrival of her extraction team 20 minutes later. As the helicopter touched down, Sarah could see that it carried a full tactical team, prepared for the possibility that the extraction might be opposed. 7-7 Alpha? The team leader called out as Sarah emerged from the tree line. That's me, she confirmed, showing her identification. We need to move fast. The enemy knows their security has been compromised. As the helicopter lifted off and headed toward friendly territory, Sarah looked back at the enemy facility one last time. Smoke was still rising from the basement explosion, and she could see security teams searching the surrounding forest. They were looking for her, but they were already too late. The intelligence she had gathered was already being analyzed by experts who would use it to prevent the planned biological weapons attack. More importantly, the exposure of Rodriguez and Harrison's treachery would lead to a comprehensive security review that would root out other conspirators. Sarah's mission had started with sabotage and betrayal, but it had ended with the prevention of a catastrophic attack and the exposure of a high-level conspiracy. The enemy's attempt to stop her by disabling her parachute had forced her to adapt and improvise, ultimately leading to an intelligence coup that would save thousands of lives. As the helicopter carried her toward debriefing and medical evaluation, Sarah reflected on the events of the past 24 hours. She had learned that sometimes the greatest threats came from within. But she had also proven that determination and adaptability could overcome even the most carefully planned sabotage. The war in Moldakistan was far from over, but Sarah's mission had prevented it from expanding into a global catastrophe. Her willingness to use enemy equipment and improvise new tactics had turned a sabotaged mission into a decisive intelligence victory. And somewhere behind enemy lines, the conspirators who had tried to stop her were discovering that they had seriously underestimated the determination of a special operations soldier with a mission to complete.